Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to the latest narration of the web series Wearing Power Armor to a Magic Score. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 55, Harbinger of Truth. I couldn't decide whether or not I'd just been thrown straight into a soap opera or a Greek tragedy, because the twists and turns of this whole situation had left me with whiplash, and then some. All of this so sudden. So unexpected, in fact, that it left me feeling like I'd just been sucker-punched. But in a good way, if that's even possible. I maintained my composure throughout the whole affair, my features not once shifting because there was nothing to really shift. This was one of the great perks of the armor. This was one of those instances where the armor stunting of all about half of human emotive abilities was coming in handy, as it allowed me to play a pretty mean poker face. Even if what was underneath the inch or so of helmet was an outright look of dumb confusion mixed with a dazed bewilderment that left my mouth hanging agape. So, let me get this straight, I began, raising a single finger as I did so. You're offering me a position, one that hasn't been offered in literal eons, just because I happened to complete some arbitrary trial that I wasn't aware even existed. Correct, the owl replied crisply. Indeed, it was not my nor the library's intent to offer you such a time-honored and storied role. However, with circumstances developing beyond what is initially expected, it seemed to be the most expedient and appropriate course of action, as it addresses both of what we seek, Cadet Emma Booker. And that is, I shot back, for you, it is the determination of truth, and the momentary suspension of the expected punishments upon that which is currently at a crossroads of our conflict of interests, the Venerian. For the library, it is the reclamation of lost knowledge by the hands of an independent party that may act beyond the confines of the treaty and the library's own rules, allowing the library to circumvent those limitations, and opening up an opportunity to regain what would otherwise be definitively lost. So you want a deniable asset, I stated without hesitation, crossing my arms as I did so. No, because you may freely state your role as a seeker if you wish. Your card of patronage will be updated to reflect this, becoming more than a mere card, but a badge worthy of the honor of seekership. Indeed, the library will make no effort to deny your involvement. The owl countered. The library cares not for the awareness of this operation should its agent wish to make it known, as that itself may be a factor which may aid the reclamation of said knowledge. Once again, I must emphasize, the library cares not for the world beyond its walls. This likewise extends to the opinions of the denizens beyond the walls, with the exception of the obligation of both parties to uphold the terms of the treaty. So you just want someone to do the heavy lifting then, I restated, or more specifically, someone to fill a role which allows you to operate beyond the restrictions of that treaty. Is that honestly it? That is, as you say, it, Cadet Emma Booker. Okay, I responded with a huff. I get you. I continued, shuffling both my hands in what would have been my BDU's jacket pockets, only to result in my arms flailing awkwardly to my side, prompting the owl to cock its head in response. I have a few more questions before I give you my answer. Is that all right? Of course, Cadet Emma Booker. I would be lying if I were to say there wasn't a part of me deep down that wanted to leap at this opportunity without question. But that part of me was driven by tales and fantastical worlds, born out of excitable mind of a young girl obsessed with fantasy. And whilst that girl was still there, she'd been tempered. As over time, and after many sessions of castles and wyverns, and after semesters worth of lessons in modern and near-modern history in school, anything involving agreements and contracts immediately set off alarm bells in my head, even if it was being offered by a cool owl with a fluffy red fox. Because if there's one thing I'd learned about the Nexus so far, it's that this realm of magic and sorcery tended to view contracts and agreements in the same way the extrasolar corpos did in the height of the corruption, as free real estate for esoteric legalese that designed to trap, ensnare, and benefit only the contract holder. And whilst the extrasolar wars had dealt a stunning blow to that culture centuries ago, leaving that final chapter of corporate exploitation firmly in the past, it was clear that the Nexus, just like the magical realms of castles and wyverns, seemed to be obsessed with keeping the tradition alive. So to set the record straight, what exactly are the terms here for me to bring back the knowledge of exactly what was lost, and in return you keep your hands off the Venerian until I can do so? Correct. But how exactly do you plan to enforce this? Through a system of regular check-ins. Weekly check-ins will be required to report on the progress made. These check-ins will be compelled and enforced by the implementation of a spell bound through magical oath that will bind the Venerian to the agreements of seekership and will intertwine his fate with that of the success, failure, or abandonment of your seeker's quest. This includes the fulfillment of these regular visits. Define compelled and define intertwining his fate, I shot back plainly. The former is a spell which will compel the will of the bound to commit to agreed terms. The latter is a spell that binds one's fate, in effect accomplishing much the same, as the momentary suspension of the Venerian's otherwise assured fate will be annulled, thus compelling him to submit to the fate awaiting him within the walls of the library. It was at that moment that I couldn't help but let out a long drawn-out sigh, as I couldn't help but feel compelled to put my foot down, right here, right now. No. I stopped the owl right there, halting it before it could get another word out. I beg your pardon, Cadet Emma Booker. Living in the present, with 3 centuries separating me from the echoes of extrasolar corporate culture, didn't mean humanity would just up and forget that dark chapter of its past. If anything, education was the key to preventing the mistakes of the past from being repeated, which was why despite centuries separating the current generation from the last extrasolar war, the issues pertinent in that era remained as ingrained in public awareness as the day they were when the war began. I said no, and I've had it up to here. I held my hand up to my neck. With these magical contracts and their invasive methods of enforcement, I would be no different to Maltoroy and his ilk if I were to just let you install even more crap in his brain for the purposes of this agreement. I paused, before once more crossing my arms and maintaining my unwavering stare. If we are to proceed with the seekership, we're going to need to work on the enforcement of its terms. Either that, or this whole thing is off the table. The latter part was a bluff I knew was a huge risk, but it was a risk I was willing to take for the sake of principle. The owl went silent for a few moments, the dark call of the void once more compelling him to look directly upwards and towards the empty abyss that had just formed in the roof. A good chunk of a minute passed by before he once more craned his head back to me. A small, looming smile had formed on his beak, or rather, it looked as if there was some sort of fascinated excitement forming behind those thoughtful eyes. 2 acts of brazen defiance in a single interaction, he spoke menacingly, and one born not out of a misplaced sense of personal pride or entitlement, but out of the same adherence to a set of morals not seen since the wild times. He chuckled. Let me be clear about one thing, Cadet Emma Booker. These weekly visits are not typical of what the library usually demands. However, they are necessary in this particular instance, as the nature of your existence means it is all but impossible to bind the Venerian to you, thus preventing us from conducting a simple binding ritual that would have otherwise been sufficient for the library. As in any other instance, the course of actions would have been to bind the Venerian's fate to you, and thus sealing his fate upon the potential failure of your seekership. Alas, this is not possible, and I believe you know why that is. My armor, I stated plainly. Correct. Therefore, the weekly visits are indeed these compulsion spells are intended to substitute for what was effectively a handicap of your seekership. Right. I took another deep breath, reaching for my forehead. The mannerless thing really throws a wrench into the works now, doesn't it? Okay, then. I can at least understand where you are coming from with this, I tentatively but diplomatically acknowledge. But surely we can come to some other agreement. I'm not about to pull a Maltoroy. I'm willing to talk trade, if it comes to it. There is nothing you can offer, Cadet Emma Booker, and not because of your inability to do so, but rather the fact that anything you offer will ultimately mean nothing in this context, as what the library desires is assurance, a sort of collateral that is meant to act as an incentive to ensure that this dependent party, this Venerian, follows through with their end of the agreement. You offering anything means nothing to the Venerian. The owl glared harshly at Eleanor as he spoke. Isn't that right, Venerian? Eleanor didn't respond to this, meekly shaking fitfully in place. Thus, without any spells of compulsion or spells of binding, the so-called collateral must be something of value to the Venerian himself, something which can compel him to return, because as much as the library values your forthrightness and has faith in your abilities, there is only so much that can be put on trust alone, especially when you are but a single mortal. Moreover, I foresee a simple means to satisfy all parties. The owl spoke as he quickly changed perches to the top of my shoulder, now peering down at the discount kobold, as I believe there might just be a solution to our troubles, one that will most certainly not involve any invasive dealings of the mind or any bindings of the flesh. What? May I have your name, Venerian? The library continued abruptly, leaning closer towards Eleanor as his pupils narrowed to tiny slits. Lord Eleanor Rularia, he managed out meekly, barely audible in fact. Lord Eleanor Rularia, the owl repeated menacingly, placing great emphasis on each and every one of those syllables, enunciating it in a way that only a disciplinarian bent on retribution could. Are you of noble blood, Lord Eleanor Rularia? The question came out of left field, taking me, as well as the rest of the gang, by surprise. Eleanor himself could only stare blankly at the owl, his mouth hanging agape and his whole body tensing like a deer in the headlights. Of course, he proclaimed sharply, making the first time in this entire interaction that he actually raised his voice beyond a squeaky whisper. But I don't see why that would be irrelevant in this. And you are a Venerian, correct? The owl interrupted, deftly and effortlessly cutting Eleanor off mid-ramble. Yes. So a noble Venerian you are, the owl once more reiterated, hopping off my shoulders and landing right in front of the terrified lord. And a noble Venerian you appear. With a single talon perched underneath where his chin would be, the librarian peered closer and closer still towards the Venerian, before finally turning back to the rest of us. I require privacy with Lord Eleanor Rularia, for the proposition I have for him is one that he more than likely would wish to remain private, the owl announced before turning back towards the very nervous Eleanor. Isn't that right, Lord Eleanor Rularia? Eleanor, strangely and contrary to my expectation, nodded in agreement. Evie, are you sure you're not detecting any spikes in mana radiation? Affirmative, Cadet Emma Booker. That rules out magically induced persuasion tactics. But still, I wasn't about to let any part of this go behind the scenes. All the library would need would be to sneak him out of my sights and potentially bind him with a spell anyways. I'd rather this meeting be concluded in the open if possible. Perhaps you could deploy a privacy screen, Dacia suggested, prompting all eyes in the room to promptly land on her. I believe what Cadet Emma Booker is fearful of is the potential for undermining of the Venerian's mind, Great Librarian. She wishes to ensure that the terms of her wishes are followed through, namely, a lack of magical binding. Thus, if the issue in question is privacy, I believe a privacy screen should act as an acceptable compromise for all parties involved. The librarian turned towards Eleanor with his expectant gaze. Is this acceptable to you, Lord Eleanor Rularia? The diminutive lizard nodded, prompting Thasia's suggestion to be taken up by a burst of mana radiation, with only 2 words from the owl preceding the bubble of silence. Very well. Alert, localized surge of mana radiation detected, 225% above background radiation levels. The next few minutes flew by surprisingly quickly. The interactions between the owl and Eleanor were seemingly tense, with Eleanor constantly pointing to a brooch on his noble attire. The only other event worth noting was Eleanor's handoff of what seemed to be a crumpled-up piece of paper, which, unfurled, proved to be the letter I returned to him earlier, except this one seemed to be stamped with the same insignia as one of the brooch he wore. Aside from that, there was no shouts or screams, no beckoning of help, no subsequent bursts of mana radiation. Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 275% above background radiation levels. Save for one near the very end. Yet, unlike most high-level spells I'd experienced thus far, this one barely caused a disruption in the mana radiation levels above that of the conjuring of the bubble of silence itself. I turned to Thassia and Thalman, both of whom seemed to understand exactly what my concerns were. There was indeed a disruption in the mana streams, Emma. However, the disruption I felt cannot account for anything that would be required of a spell of binding or compulsion, Thassia acknowledged. Indeed it is, the owl openly acknowledged, the privacy screen having come down just as Thassia finished addressing my concerns. You have nothing to fret over, Cadet Emma Booker. Lord Eleanor Relaria and I have come to an agreement, one which the library deems sufficient to ensure his compliance with these weekly visits. Eleanor sheepishly nodded in reply, reaching a hand up to scratch both of his cheeks, which seemed to finally have some color returning to it. Immediately turning to address Eleanor, circumventing the owl entirely. Eleanor, what exactly did you... Can we just get on with it, New Rama? I haven't the energy nor the compulsion to spend any more time in the stuffy room than I need to, he responded sharply. So, you're fine with this agreement, I reiterated, because I don't want to move forward if... Well, it is not what I would have preferred, that being complete, outright, and instantaneous exoneration. It is certainly more agreeable than mind manipulation, New Rama, Eleanor stated plainly. So what? I will disclose the nature of the agreement when I feel like it. He stopped me before I could even get those words out. Right, I spoke, turning to the owl once more. So do we have an agreement, Cadet Emma Booker? Your seekership, with the aims to exonerate the Venerian, will cover the gathering of the topics of what was lost. It is meant to serve two purposes. One, as a partial recuperation of the library's losses, and two, as a trial to assess your investigative abilities, to act as a benchmark to determine whether or not you are capable of pursuing a far larger quest of retrieving all of what was lost. What you will gain from this, in the meanwhile, is the suspension of the Venerian's otherwise guaranteed fate, which shall remain suspended until such time where your seekership comes to an end, either by failure or success. And the whole issue of the Venerian's inability to be bound to me for my seekership, that's been addressed by weekly visits, as well as the mystery agreement between you two to convince him to return to the library weekly, right? That is correct, Cadet Emma Booker. And what about delays? What if we have something urgent to do that'll cause us to become otherwise incapable of returning to the library within a time frame, like a field trip or a dragon quest or something? The owl seemingly grinned at that question, but it wasn't clear if it was because of the questioning, skeptical nature of my stance, or the mention of the dragon quest. Deferrals may be requested as is necessary. The library is not unreasonable. Moreover, you can rest assured that even if the time limit is breached, that the agreement set forth will result in no bodily or mental harm to the Venerian. He turned to Eleanor once more with a satisfied gaze. Such is the nature of our unique arrangement, before turning back to me. A concession which has not been made since the wild times, so take that as you will. With all that cleared up, the ball was finally thrown back to my court as to how I wanted to proceed. The fact that we come from an assured death sentence to what amounted to an extended parole contingent on data recovery was nothing short of a miracle, especially given the evidence we had to work with. Moreover, the fact that it wasn't just contingent on incriminating Maltroy meant we had more room to work with, as we now had two avenues of attack by which to approach this whole mess. So, if the investigation on Maltroy's front hit a brick wall, then we'd at least have the data recovery to save Eleanor from assured death. More than that, though, it wasn't like this quest wasn't without its benefits to my overarching mission. Data gathering, intelligence sorting, and scouting was always one of the key goals of this mission. Whilst I already had a checklist and a guideline that was definitely useful, this whole questline effectively gave me a laundry list of self-admitted vital intelligence that the Nexus themselves want hidden away from me. In a weird, convoluted way, I just struck on uncorked data mine, as the topics I needed to find were presumably the very topics that I would have needed to look for anyways when it came to the vital Nexian intel. It was more work for me, of course, Well, that's what I signed up for. So I couldn't really complain. I accept, I announced dryly. This prompted the room to once more shudder, except this time it wasn't so much an aggressive vibration, but one that was measured, consistent, and strangest of all, resonant in the noises it made. Several things began manifesting all at once with a flurry of mana radiation warnings. Starting off with various quilts and tapestries in the open attic above, unfurling and unrolling. Some of them doing so by unseen ethereal force, some by the aid of foxes that jumped, leapt, and scurried from corner to corner. Soon enough, we found ourselves standing right in the middle of a room that had just been elevated from a quaint Woodlands hotel lobby to a quaint Woodlands hotel lobby with celebrity decorations. But in a good way. As what it lacked in flash or flair, it made up for in heart, with each of the painstakingly woven tapestries being hung at odd angles and to varying degrees of success, but done so with care and attention that felt honest and genuine, rather than the cold perfection that normally came with the library's otherwise constant changes in set dressing. Each of the unfurled tapestries depicted what seemed to be scenes of great battles and quests in what appeared to be individually tailored murals of various adventurers, their faces and names etched on top right of the tapestries. What's more, what sounded like tavern music began playing in the background, as lutes, guitars, and other various string, percussion, and woodwind instruments echoed throughout the room, all played by a whole gaggle of foxes that coordinated in ways I couldn't have ever imagined was possible, even of them performing carefully coordinated movements that made up for the lack of opposable thumbs and dexterous hands. It was in the midst of all of this that Buddy, who had been absent since the proposition of my seekership, finally returned with something in his maw, something that he now offered to me with excited eyes. With a small urging from the owl, I grabbed it gently, unfurled the rolled-up quilted fabric to reveal a series of letters that formed my name, and what seemed to be an unfinished reproduction of my helmet at the top right corner, stitched up in what I could only describe was a chibi version of it, tilted at an angle, with one eye seemingly larger than the other, giving it a goofy but endearing expression. "I did what I could in the time I had, Emma," Buddy yapped out excitedly, jumping up and down with a series of 4 clacks as each one of the clawed paws hit the ground in rapid succession. I could barely form the words as Buddy continued looking up at me with expectant, excited gaze. "This is incredible, Buddy. I love it." The fox went wild at my affirmations, giggling, cackling, laying on his back before rolling from side to side from one support beam to another. Several more foxes soon came to take the fabric away as they lifted it up high and above my head and began hanging it from the 2 of the taller support beams, giving the impression that the whole celebration was for me. "Cadet Emma Booker," the owl announced pridefully, enunciating my name in a way that was almost an exact opposite of the way he'd regarded Illinois a while ago. "The library is humbled to ratify your entry into the ranks of the Seekership. Whilst this celebration may seem quaint compared to what the library has become, it has remained unchanged since the induction of the last Seeker eons ago. The library sees no reason to change it, especially as you remind it of the wild times that have long since passed. With all of that being said," the librarian paused, grabbing what seemed to be another book from a haphazardly constructed bookshelf with his own talons, before opening it up to a page with a series of names similar to a hotel guest book. Buddy soon walked over with what appeared to be a quill and a bottle of ink, setting it on the counter, as I looked at the whole setup warily. The memories of the yearbook signing were still vivid in my memories. "Evie, do you detect any mana from these artifacts?" "Negative, Cadet Booker. All items seem to be inert." "If you're concerned about the potential for binding, don't be," the owl announced suddenly. "I would have made that one point clear to you if that were the case. This is merely tradition, one which you don't explicitly need to partake in if you wish. There were many seekers prior to this who likewise refused the signing, for either reasons of personal intent or reasons of faith." I took a moment to consider this before reaching for the quill. I dipped it tentatively in the ink, testing it, but feeding nothing. None of the excessive weight from the yearbook ceremony, no sign of mana radiation, nothing at all. Turning towards Thasia, the princess responded with a confident nod, reassuring me that my senses were detecting everything correctly. With a single breath, I took the plunge, signing my name all the while monitoring the EVI for any spikes of mana radiation, or even the mysterious +1 radiation for that matter. None came. In fact, several foxes came to physically dry out the ink by using spare sheets of paper lying around. Cadet Emma Booker, henceforth you shall be known to the library as a harbinger of truth, a fellow amongst equals, and a name amongst the forever named. Your tales, your action, your existence in this time shall be preserved for all eternity. Oh, the library is eternal, the chorus of foxes spoke up once more in unison. And the memories of its members shall remain eternally, the owl added pridefully. The whole room broke into a series of uproarious cheers, which, given that it was composed entirely of foxes, turned out to be a cacophony of yips, yaps, and fox-like cackles that momentarily drowned out the music. It was after a few moments of this the cart made of similarly rustic wood came out with a series of snacks that screamed homemade. But, just like before, my suit barred me from tasting any of it. Thank you, librarian, I managed out awkwardly, but I have one final question, if that's all right. Of course, Cadet Emma Booker. Now that the whole great scarring situation has been taken care of, what's going to happen to the Academy's investigation? I asked in the midst of celebrations, with foxes yipping and yapping and beginning their assaults on the very food cart they brought out. The library will inform the designated conduit, in this case the incumbent dean of the Transgression Academy, regarding the lack of necessity for activation of Article 25 of the treaty. The owl responded with a tactical hoot. Right, and how exactly will you inform him of this? Through the appropriate channels, with myself acting as the representative. So, only a member of the library is allowed to act as a representative to relay this message, correct? Why, of course, Buddy piped in, popping his frosting-smeared head up from a cake on the food cart. Thanks, Buddy, I acknowledged the fox with a nod before shifting to the owl. Then I have a small proposition to make, librarian. Would it be possible for me to inform the dean of this development? The owl paused, taking a moment to consider this before responding with a nod. How rather sudden for you to wish more responsibilities to be burdened with. But very well. As an act of good faith, I will designate this task to you, Seeker. Consider this another test of your seekership. The owl, with a small burst of mana radiation, pulled out a letter about the same height as him from under his wing. Deliver this to the man. You need not say anything more, as the contents of this letter will address all that requires addressing. You know, I let out a chuckle. In my world, it's usually people who give birds messages to deliver, I spoke, prompting both the librarian and Thasia to shoot me 2 simultaneous side-eyes in the process. Anyways, yes, will do, I attempted to swiftly move past that. With all that being said, it is getting pretty late, so I plan on heading out now, if that's all right. A series of despondent whines was an immediate reaction to the announcement. A swift end to a seekership induction ceremony is not unheard of. In fact, the shortest one was scantly 5 seconds in length, interrupted by a raid of all things. So you may leave, and you may return again at any time. As always, the library appreciates your patronage and your contributions, Seeker. With a nod from me and a bow of respect from Thasia, we made our leave. However, right before we left through the front door, Thelman promptly turned towards me. So what's our plan of attack with this investigation? I'd prefer to at least recoup for a bit before we jump into our next quest, but honestly, our best bet would be Maltroy's office. That drone had issues getting there, sure, but after I head out to recover the drones that survived, and with a bit of more planning, I'm sure that we can get into a sanctum of evil. That's our first lead. Our second is Apprentice Lariel. Beyond that, there's always Vanavan we can squeeze for information. The Dean, who I'm planning to meet tomorrow anyways, and heck, a whole lot of places that I probably don't even know about yet. Suffice it to say, there's a lot out there to search for, so don't worry. I know we'll be able to pull it off. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Bushmaster 177, HenryTheRed, Casper Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Sevaren Serberous. Thank you very much.